It is the spring of 1945, and the war in Europe is bleeding out its final days. Across the German heartland, white sheets and tablecloths hang from window frames. Townspeople push handcarts loaded with their possessions to the nearest crossroad, hoping the Americans will arrive before the Soviets do. German soldiers, by the hundreds of thousands, are choosing survival over orders, throwing down their weapons and raising their hands. The Reich, which once promised 1,000 years of glory, is collapsing at such speed that American tank crews are driving through towns faster than the residents can prepare a welcome. Cities that might have required weeks of brutal fighting are surrendering in hours, sometimes before a single shot is fired. And then there is Aschaffenburg. Aschaffenburg is a city of roughly 38,000 people sitting on the eastern bank of the Main River in Bavaria, about 40 miles southeast of Frankfurt. It is a beautiful place, or at least it was. It has centuries of history layered into its streets. The Schloss Johannisberg, a magnificent Renaissance palace built between 1605 and 1614, dominates the city from its elevated position above the river. Below it, the 10th century Stiftskirche, a Roman Catholic papal basilica, rises over the narrow streets of the old town. Stone buildings pressed close together, medieval alleyways, bridges arching over the river. A city that had survived the religious wars, the 30 Years' War, and the Franco-Prussian War, only to be thrown into the grinding machinery of 1945. By late March 1945, Aschaffenburg controls something the American command desperately needs. It sits at the convergence of rail lines, highways, and bridge crossings over the Main River. Patton's Third Army is driving east at extraordinary speed, and Aschaffenburg stands directly in the path of that advance. Getting across the Main at Aschaffenburg would allow armored columns to continue deep into the German heartland without costly detours or delays. Every day the city holds out is a day the broader campaign is slowed. The Americans expected it to fall quickly. They were wrong. Section 2, the man called Old Blood and Guts. To understand what happened at Aschaffenburg, you need to understand George Smith Patton, Jr. Born into a wealthy Californian family with deep Virginia military roots in November 1885, Patton was shaped from childhood by a single conviction: that he was meant for war. His grandfather had died fighting for the Confederacy at the Battle of Winchester. His great-uncle had fallen at Pickett's charge. Military service wasn't a career for the Patton family. It was a calling that bordered on religion. As a child, George was read passages from Caesar's Gallic Wars at bedtime. He grew up knowing the terrain of ancient battlefields better than most adults. He was not a natural student. He struggled academically at West Point and had to repeat his first year. But he graduated, became an Olympic pentathlete at the 1912 Stockholm Games, competing in pistol shooting, swimming, fencing, equestrian riding, and cross-country running, and slowly, methodically built himself into one of the finest military minds of the 20th century. He designed the M1913 Cavalry Sabre, which still bears his name. He was the first American officer commissioned into the Army's new tank corps during the First World War, and he personally led tanks into battle during the Saint-Mihiel offensive in 1918, ignoring orders to stay behind and charging forward on foot when his tank became disabled. Between the wars, while other officers played golf, Patton was reading military history obsessively. Napoleon, Rommel, Hannibal. He studied them all with the hunger of a man preparing for a specific destiny. When the Second World War came, he was ready. His operational record in that war is almost without parallel. He led the assault on Casablanca in 1942. He turned around the shattered American forces in Tunisia after the disaster at Kasserine Pass. He commanded the Seventh Army during the invasion of Sicily in 1943, and from August 1944, commanding the Third Army in France, he put on a performance that left even his enemies in awe. His Third Army swept out of Normandy in one of the great breakout operations in military history, covering ground so fast that supply lines couldn't keep up. When the Battle of the Bulge nearly broke the Allied line in December 1944, Patton performed what many consider the most extraordinary feat of maneuver in the entire war, wheeling 6 divisions 90 degrees in the middle of a brutal winter and driving north to relieve Bastogne in a matter of days. By the spring of 1945, Patton's Third Army comprised between 250,000 and 300,000 men. It had crossed 24 major rivers, captured 81,500 square miles of territory, and engaged and destroyed German forces at a rate that stunned Allied planners. The Germans themselves issued specific guidance about what to do when facing Patton: retreat, disengage, and avoid contact wherever possible. German Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, asked after the war to name America's best general, answered without hesitation, Patton. He had already crossed the Rhine on March 22nd, 2 weeks before Montgomery's much-heralded crossing further north. He had literally stopped in the middle of the Rhine River to urinate into it, because that is exactly the kind of man he was. He arrived at every engagement radiating absolute certainty, the 3 stars gleaming on his polished helmet, the ivory-handled revolvers at his hips, the riding jodhpurs and immaculate uniform communicating to everyone within sight that this man believed in the theater of command as much as the mechanics of it. Patton was feared by his enemies and terrified some of his own men. He once slapped a hospitalized soldier suffering from combat fatigue, calling him a coward, and the resulting scandal nearly ended his career. He cursed freely, prayed fervently, and drove to the front lines personally, not to supervise, but to fight. He once said that the highest purpose of any military commander was to make the other side's soldiers die for their country, not your own. He was, in other words, precisely the wrong man to encounter if you were a German garrison commander in a fortified city in Bavaria in the spring of 1945. Section 3. Hitler's Doctrine of Last Stands. To understand why the Battle of Aschaffenburg happened at all, why it was so brutal, so destructive, so needlessly costly, you need to understand a policy that Adolf Hitler began implementing from early 1944 onward: the Festung doctrine. Festung means fortress. In Hitler's increasingly unhinged strategic thinking, designating a city a Festung, a fortress city, or Festungsstadt, was not merely a military instruction. It was a declaration of absolute commitment. Cities designated as Festungen were ordered to be supplied with food and ammunition, defended to the final cartridge, and held at all costs without retreat or surrender. Any commander who abandoned his post was to be shot. Any soldier who attempted to flee was to be hanged from the nearest lamppost as a warning to others. Hitler had been haunted by the failure at Stalingrad, where the encircled Sixth Army had finally surrendered in February 1943 after months of catastrophic fighting. He believed, with the irrational conviction that characterized his command style in the war's later years, that if the German forces at Stalingrad had only fought harder and held longer, the tide might have turned. And so he replicated the policy across the entire Reich as the Allies closed in from east and west. The results, almost without exception, were catastrophic. Königsberg in East Prussia was besieged for months before falling, at enormous cost to both sides. Breslau, now Wrocław in modern Poland, endured a nightmarish 80-day siege that killed over 25,000 people and reduced vast sections of one of Europe's great cities to rubble, finally capitulating on May 6, 1945, 4 days after Berlin itself fell. Frankfurt was declared a Frontstadt, a frontline city. Warsaw was fought over block by bloody block. The pattern was always the same: Hitler's order, a desperate and increasingly ill-equipped garrison, and the destruction of the city and its population in service of a cause already beyond saving. The Festung strategy, as one historian has noted, played directly into Allied hands. Declaring a city a fortress and ordering it defended to the last man simply gave the Americans and Soviets a fixed target to surround, pound with artillery and air power, and systematically reduce. Rather than keeping German forces mobile and preserving fighting strength, the fortress doctrine turned cities into traps, grinding wheels that consumed the remaining strength of the Wehrmacht while accomplishing nothing of strategic value. It was madness. But when the order came down from Hitler's bunker in Berlin, most German commanders, one way or another, followed it. Section 4. The man who would hold Aschaffenburg. The man given the task of defending Aschaffenburg was not, as one might expect, a battle-hardened SS general or a fanatical party man. He was a schoolteacher. Major Emil Lamberth had been an ordinary teacher before the war, who maintained a reserve military commission on the side. He arrived in Aschaffenburg in June 1944 to take command of the 9th Pioneer, that is, combat engineer, battalion. He was a World War I veteran with a practical, if not inspired, military record. By January 1945, as the Allied armies ground ever closer, he had worked his way up to senior garrison commander of the city. On March 5, 1945, Lamberth was formally appointed combat commander of Kampfkommando Aschaffenburg, the battle group that would defend the city, and took a personal oath to Adolf Hitler to defend it. A small SS delegation was dispatched to the city specifically to monitor him and ensure compliance with the Festungsstadt order. For Lamberth, the presence of these SS overseers was not a comfort. According to his own post-war testimony, the SS men operated less like comrades and more like armed supervisors, watching for any sign of defeatism or deviation from the fight to the last mandate. The garrison Lamberth commanded was, to put it plainly, a mix of whatever could be scraped together. The initial force of around 5,000 men, labeled Kampfkommando Aschaffenburg, was built from Wehrmacht regulars, reserve units, replacement troops, officer cadets from the local training school, soldiers convalescing from wounds in local hospitals, Volkssturm Home Guard militia composed largely of elderly men and boys, and even some civilians pressed into service. Reinforcements during the battle would bring the garrison to roughly 8,500 men. They had perhaps 32 machine guns for the entire force. The professional, well-equipped German army of 1940, this was not, but what they lacked in equipment and manpower, they made up for in desperation, preparation, and the brutal mathematics of urban terrain. Lamberth had been thinking about the city's defense for months. He had helped design a defensive scheme tied into the larger defense line along the main river. He used the terrain skillfully. The Spessart Mountain foothills to the north, east, and south created natural choke points that funneled any attacker into frontal approaches under fire. The city's stone buildings, massive, close-packed masonry structures that dated in some cases back to the medieval period, provided superb defensive cover and made artillery suppression enormously difficult. The main river itself, flowing along the western edge of the city, meant that any American assault would have to cross water under fire before even entering the urban area. He placed defenders in the upper floors and cellars of buildings, creating overlapping fields of fire. He booby-trapped doors and roads. He positioned men in the towers of the Schloss Johannesburg, in factory chimneys, in church steeples, anywhere that provided elevation and concealment. Resupply and communication lines were planned and organized in advance. Lamberth was no strategic genius, but he was a competent, methodical officer who used what he had as well as it could be used. On Palm Sunday, March 25, 1945, at 9 o'clock in the morning, Lamberth received word that American forces had been spotted just 9 miles west of the city. By noon, sentries in the towers of the Schloss Johannesburg could see them coming. The battle was about to begin. Section 5. 10 Days of Hell. The Americans who first approached Aschaffenburg were elements of Combat Command B of the 4th Armored Division, led by the young and already celebrated Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, the same Creighton Abrams who would one day command all American forces in Vietnam, and whose name would be given to the M1 Abrams main battle tank, the backbone of American armored forces today. Abrams quickly recognized that he didn't have enough infantry for a proper urban assault, and by March 27th, responsibility for taking the city passed to the 45th Infantry Division under Major General Robert Frederick, a battle-hardened formation that had been fighting since the invasion of Sicily in 1943, accumulating 511 days of combat experience and over 20,000 casualties across Sicily, Italy, southern France, and now Germany. Frederick assigned the task to the 157th Infantry Regiment, commanded by Colonel Walter O'Brien. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, who would later be one of the officers present at the liberation of Dachau, commanded the regiment's 3rd Battalion and led the way. The battle that followed, running from March 28th through April 3rd, 1945, was one of the most savage urban engagements American forces fought in the entire European theater. The 157th crossed the main river over an intact railroad bridge. The 4th Armored had seized it intact before withdrawing and established a bridgehead. Then they began moving into the city. Every foot of ground had to be taken physically, personally, under fire. The Americans couldn't rely on simply outflanking positions or using their armor's mobility, because the narrow streets and dense stone buildings stripped away those advantages entirely. Tank cannon were fired point-blank into building facades to blast through walls. Grenades went through every doorway before any soldier did. Infantry learned to blow holes through interior walls and move through buildings laterally rather than risk the booby-trapped front doors and stairwells. The Germans fought with the ferocity of men who knew, even if they would not admit, that there was no exit. They set up machine guns in cellars with slitted windows at street level, giving them a near-invisible field of fire that cut down anyone moving in the open. Snipers concealed themselves in the rubble of already destroyed buildings, firing and then moving before they could be pinpointed. Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets, the German equivalent of a disposable bazooka, destroyed at least 6 Sherman tanks during the fighting. German counterattacks were launched repeatedly, including one major push on the night of March 28th and 29th, when elements of the 36th Volksgrenadier Division attacked from outside the city to try to relieve pressure on the garrison, briefly breaking through American lines before being contained. The civilian population, roughly 3,000 people who had remained in the city despite evacuation orders, sheltered in cellars as the battle raged above them. The beautiful stone architecture of Aschaffenburg was being systematically destroyed around them. The Schloss Johannesburg, that magnificent Renaissance palace that had stood for 300 years, was damaged by Allied bombing and artillery. Medieval churches that had survived Reformation-era wars were reduced to jagged shells. Streets that had been walked by generations of ordinary Bavarian families became killing grounds, contested block by block, and within the German lines, fear was enforced at gunpoint. On March 26th, Lamberth ordered the court-martial and hanging of a convalescing officer named Lieutenant Hayman, accused of desertion for failing to report to the garrison command. Hayman was convicted and hanged from a lamppost in the street outside a cafe, a placard calling him a coward attached to his body, which was left hanging as a warning. A second hanging followed, a Luftwaffe officer who claimed he had no relevant skills to contribute to the defense. American troops and war correspondents who entered the city reported seeing bodies hanging from lampposts throughout the city center. The Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, specifically mentioned Aschaffenburg in a press conference on April 7th, noting that Nazi fanatics had used the visible threat of executions to keep soldiers fighting. Post-war accounts suggest that Lamberth himself was, to a degree, trapped between the demands of the Festung order and the realities of command. His own testimony described SS overseers constantly interfering with his decisions, pressuring the defense toward greater severity. A 1949 newspaper account stated that Lamberth had been intoxicated when he sentenced Lieutenant Hayman to death. The truth, as with much of what happens inside a besieged city, under extreme psychological pressure, is probably irreducible to a simple verdict. What is certain is that some men who wanted to surrender were prevented from doing so, and some died for refusing a fight that had already been decided. As the days wore on and the battle entered its second week, the German position became mathematically untenable. The garrison was losing men faster than it could replace them. Ammunition stocks, which had never been generous, were being exhausted. Food and water were increasingly scarce. The SS overseers, who had been monitoring the garrison's commitment, began quietly withdrawing from the city as conditions deteriorated. The higher German headquarters, 82nd Corps, withdrew as well, leaving Lamberth's command isolated and unsupported. German soldiers began surrendering in small groups, slipping through the rubble with their hands raised, many of them weeping with what American soldiers described as relief rather than shame. The Americans processed them with cold efficiency, following the Geneva Convention, but offering no particular warmth to men who had prolonged a hopeless battle and cost hundreds of lives. By Easter Sunday, April 1st, the 45th Division was enveloping the city from multiple directions, seizing the surrounding towns of Geilbach, Halbach, Goldbach, and Hosbach to cut off any remaining escape routes. The noose was pulled tight over the following 2 days. On the morning of April 3, 1945, with the last pockets of resistance being systematically reduced, Major Emil Lamberth climbed to the damaged towers of the Schloss Johannesburg and hung white flags. At 9 o'clock in the morning, he surrendered to Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks. It was over. Section 6, The Price in Blood and Stone. The cost of the Battle of Aschaffenburg is stark when listed in numbers, but numbers are, as always, too clean to fully describe what they represent. American forces from the 45th Infantry Division, primarily the 157th Infantry Regiment, suffered approximately 20 killed and 300 wounded during the battle. At least 6 Sherman tanks were destroyed. These numbers, by the standards of larger engagements, might seem modest, but every one of those killed or wounded men represented a family, a community, and a future that would not happen. And these were men killed fighting a battle that changed nothing of strategic consequence, a battle that, as the Americans had anticipated before it began, was already lost from the German side before the first shot was fired. German casualties were dramatically higher. Post-war assessments estimated around 1,600 killed or wounded among the garrison of roughly 8,500 men. An additional 3,500 German soldiers were captured following the surrender, meaning that the garrison suffered a casualty rate exceeding 60%. Many of these men were not hardened soldiers making a calculated military judgment. They were officer cadets, recovering wounded, elderly militia volunteers, and very young men who found themselves sworn into a hopeless defense by a machine that had long since stopped caring whether they lived or died. And then there is the city itself. Aschaffenburg was comprehensively devastated. Much of the historic architecture that had given the city its identity for centuries was destroyed or severely damaged. The point-blank use of tank and artillery fire to blast through masonry buildings, necessary given the tactics the German defenders employed, reduced whole streets to rubble. The Schloss Johannesburg was damaged badly enough that it required extensive post-war restoration before it could be returned to any functional state. The smaller historic buildings, the merchants' houses and guild halls and churches that no one was planning to restore, simply ceased to exist. When the U.S. Secretary of War Stimson specifically cited Aschaffenburg by name in his press conference on April 7th, within days of the city's fall, it was because the battle had become a symbol. Not a symbol of heroic resistance, but of what the Festung doctrine actually accomplished when it met determined American force: the obliteration of the very thing it claimed to protect. Section 7. The Hammelburg Shadow. There is an additional layer to the story of Aschaffenburg that adds complexity to Patton's involvement and reveals something about the man that sits uncomfortably alongside his reputation for ice-cold tactical clarity. Concurrent with the early stages of the Aschaffenburg battle, on the evening of March 26th, Patton dispatched Task Force Baum, 313 men, 11 officers, 16 tanks, and various other vehicles under the command of Captain Abraham Baum, on a secret, unauthorized raid 50 to 60 miles behind German lines to liberate the prisoner of war camp at Hammelburg. Among the prisoners at Hammelburg, Patton knew or strongly suspected was his own son-in-law, Sewar Lieutenant Colonel John K. Waters, who had been captured in Tunisia in February 1943. Patton later claimed the mission was purely humanitarian, driven by fear that retreating Germans would execute Allied prisoners. No one else believed this, including General Eisenhower, who was furious when he found out. Creighton Abrams, brilliant, experienced, arguably the best armor commander in the American Army, opposed the raid and wanted to take his entire combat command, if they were going anyway. Patton overruled him and sent a fraction of the necessary force. The raid was a disaster. Task Force Baum fought its way through Schweinheim at the southern edge of the Aschaffenburg defensive zone, reached the camp, opened it briefly, during which Waters was shot and wounded by a German guard, and then was surrounded and destroyed on its withdrawal. 32 men were killed. Only 35 made it back to Allied lines. All 57 vehicles were lost. Patton later admitted it was the only mistake he made in the entire European campaign, though even then he specified that the error was sending too small a force, not in attempting the mission. He personally decorated both Baumann the Wounded Waters, who survived and was liberated by the 14th Armored Division 9 days after the failed raid. The shadow this casts on Aschaffenburg is subtle but real. Patton was during the days the 45th Division was beginning its assault on the city, simultaneously pursuing a deeply personal operation that even he acknowledged was unauthorized and motivated at least in part by family loyalty. A man who regularly and loudly criticized commanders, who let personal feelings cloud military judgment, had allowed exactly that to happen. It makes him more human, perhaps, and it sits in complicated tension with the lecture he would later deliver to the man who refused to surrender. Section 8. Face to Face. After the city fell, Lamberth was captured and brought before the American divisional commander, who informed him that General Patton wished to speak with him in person. Lamberth straightened what remained of his torn and dirty uniform. Whatever else he was, he had been a German officer. He would face his captor with whatever dignity he could manage. He was driven to Patton's forward headquarters and escorted into the general's office. What happened next is reconstructed from accounts recorded by participants and observers. Patton was behind a desk covered with maps and operational reports, wearing his characteristic uniform, the gleaming three-star helmet, the ivory-handled revolvers. He did not rise when Lamberth entered. He did not offer a seat. He studied the German commander for a long, uncomfortable moment, with what witnesses described as undisguised contempt. Then he spoke. What Patton said in that room was not the fury one might expect from a man whose forces had just spent 10 days fighting through a city they should have walked into unopposed. It was, by several accounts, something more deliberate and more cutting than anger. It was a systematic dismantling of any claim Lamberth might have made to having served his men well, or his country well, or anyone well. Patton acknowledged, reportedly, that he had fought and killed many Germans in the war, and that most of those men died for something, for their country, for their families, for the comrades beside them in the line. This was honest. Patton had genuine respect for soldiers who fought well. He was not a man who despised his enemies simply because they were enemies. But then he turned to what Lamberth's men had died for, a city that was going to fall anyway. An order from a man who was hiding in a bunker in Berlin while others bled for his ego. Lives thrown away, German lives and American lives both. For nothing measurable, nothing salvageable, nothing that advanced any purpose except the momentary extension of a war already decided. He told Lamberth by accounts that he could respect bravery. He could respect a man who fought for his country, even when his country was wrong. What he could not respect was a fool, and a fool, in Patton's terms, was a man who threw away the lives of those under his command for a lost cause, knowing it was lost, because he was too proud or too afraid of the consequences of disobeying to make the right decision. He reportedly told Lamberth that, in another era, he might have had him shot for what he had done. Instead, Patton said, Lamberth would have to live with the knowledge that his last act as a soldier had been a stupid, pointless waste of lives. His men's lives and American lives both. Then he turned away and told his staff to remove the German commander from his sight. Section 9. The lesson and the legacy Emil Lamberth spent several years in prisoner of war captivity after the battle. He was tried for manslaughter in post-war German courts for the executions carried out during the siege, specifically the hanging of Lieutenant Hayman. He was convicted and sentenced to 4 years in prison. though the sentence was reduced by the court on the grounds that Lamberth had been operating under severe pressure from SS overseers and Nazi Party officials. Historical accounts of the man are divided. Some American veterans of the battle saw him as a ruthless ideologue who drove men to pointless deaths. German accounts were more nuanced, presenting a man trapped inside a system that left him almost no latitude. The Truth, as the Warfare History Network, concluded in its detailed analysis, is probably somewhere between the two positions. Whatever one concludes about Lamberth personally, the battle's consequences were concrete and far-reaching. Patton did not simply move on and forget Aschaffenburg. He used it. American aircraft dropped leaflets over German cities still contemplating resistance, showing photographs of the destruction wrought on Aschaffenburg and carrying a simple message: this is what happens when you refuse to surrender. This is what your city will look like if you force the American army to take it by force. The effect was measurable. In the final weeks of the war, as the Third Army and other American formations advanced through Bavaria, Württemberg, and the surrounding region, cities that might plausibly have attempted resistance chose instead to put out white flags. German commanders, having seen or heard of what happened to Aschaffenburg, decided that dying for Hitler was not a transaction worth making. Thousands of lives on both sides were almost certainly saved because one city's destruction served as a sufficiently vivid warning to others. It is a grim kind of arithmetic. The suffering of Aschaffenburg was in part converted into the preservation of other places and other lives. That doesn't make the battle less terrible. It doesn't restore what was destroyed or return the dead. But it does give the 10 days of hell some frame of meaning that extends beyond the city itself. Secretary of War Stimson put it plainly in his April 7th press conference, specifically naming Aschaffenburg as a lesson in what fanaticism costs. A week's worth of forced combat, 2 hangings used as coercion, and a city reduced to rubble, all to delay an outcome that was never in doubt. Section 10. What Patton Understood. The confrontation between Patton and Lamberth contains, in concentrated form, one of the war's deeper arguments about what courage and duty actually require. Patton was not, in any conventional sense, a cautious man. He took risks constantly. Operational risks, personal risks, career risks. He drove to the front lines when generals were supposed to stay behind. He crossed the Rhine before anyone else because he could and because waiting would have driven him mad. He dispatched Task Force Bomb into a situation multiple experienced commanders told him was catastrophically under-resourced, partly for reasons that had nothing to do with military necessity. But Patton had a principle that ran deeper than his aggression. He did not throw lives away for nothing. He fought to win. He fought to achieve objectives that mattered. He was willing to accept casualties, sometimes heavy ones, to break through a line or exploit an opportunity or turn a battle. What he was not willing to do was sacrifice soldiers in service of pride or ideology, or a lost cause whose outcome was already written. This was, in many ways, the central moral failure he identified in Lamberth's defense of Aschaffenburg, not cowardice. Patton had some grudging respect for the tactical competence the defense demonstrated, but a specific kind of moral bankruptcy, the willingness to spend other people's lives on behalf of an order that served no one, in defense of a cause that had already failed, because the courage required to disobey was harder than the courage required to simply keep fighting. There is a distinction that matters here, and Patton, for all his theatrical bluster and genuine occasional cruelty, seems to have understood it clearly. Bravery and stubbornness are not the same thing. Courage and compliance are not the same thing. A man can be physically fearless and morally hollow at the same time. Lamberth ordered his men to keep fighting, not because fighting could achieve anything, but because the alternative, disobeying Hitler's order, surrendering, accepting the end, required a different and harder kind of courage that he either did not have or did not believe was permitted. The German generals and commanders who chose differently in those final weeks, who hung sheets from their windows, who met American officers with white flags and formal surrenders, who calculated that their duty to their men outweighed their duty to an order from a bunker in Berlin, made exactly the choice Patton believed a real commander should make. Not weakness, not betrayal. The recognition that a fight is over and that the honorable response to a finished fight is to end it before more people die in its rubble. Aschaffenburg is remembered today as a beautiful Bavarian city on the Main. The Schloss Johannisberg was carefully restored and stands as it did before the war. The Stiftskirche still rises above the rooftops. New buildings replaced what was destroyed. The city rebuilt. The dead on both sides remained dead. Patton died 8 months after the battle, not in combat, but in a low-speed car accident on December 9, 1945, dying of his injuries 12 days later in a hospital in Heidelberg. He was 60 years old. He had survived campaigns on 3 continents, 2 world wars, and more engagements than most soldiers see in several lifetimes. And he was killed by bad luck on a peacetime road. Field Marshal von Rundstedt's assessment, Patton was your best, stands as the most credible post-war verdict. Lamberth was eventually released from prison, the details of his later life fading from the historical record, living in post-war West Germany in the long shadow of what happened in the spring of 1945 in the city he had pledged under oath to defend. The 10 days of Aschaffenburg cost hundreds of lives, destroyed much of a city that had taken centuries to build, and achieved nothing except a brief delay in an advance that could not be stopped. It produced one confrontation in a small office between 2 men, a German major who had followed his orders all the way to catastrophe, and an American general who had spent his career understanding that following orders is the beginning of a soldier's duty, not the whole of it. And what Patton said to the man who refused to surrender was, at its core, what any honest reckoning says to those who spend lives on finished causes, that bravery without judgment is just a different kind of failure, that the men under your command are not yours to throw away, and that some fights, when they are over, need to be recognized as over. And the courage required for that recognition is real courage, no less demanding than anything that happens under fire. If you found this story as compelling as I did, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to WW2 Tales. It genuinely helps the channel reach more people who love this kind of deep, story-driven history. There's a lot more to come, and every subscriber makes it possible to keep telling these stories the way they deserve to be told. Thank you for watching.